Welcome to the Inside the Guard podcast. I'm your host, TP Grant, and today we're going to be talking about UFC 181 Hendricks versus Lawler. A fight card that was absolutely stacked with action. Really lived up to the hype as being kind of a throwback card to the old days of UFC cards that really actually had quality fighters on them, top to bottom. Now, quick reminder, this is not a results show. There are plenty of excellent results shows out there that happen in the immediacy after the event and really capture that feel. I was on the Bloody Elbow radio show, which is available on iTunes and on Bloody Elbow. Additionally, on Bloody Elbow, there's the 6th round with Nate Wilcox and Zane Simon. And I also highly recommend the Sherdog Radio Network's Beat Down After the Bell with Jordan Breen. An absolute staple, listening staple for me when it comes to post-event listening. I almost always listen to it the Sunday after an event. This show is going to focus in on a few key bouts and really kind of get into depth. And primarily we're going to be looking at the Hendricks-Lawler fight and the Antonio Pettis-Gilbert Melendez fights, with a couple of branching it out into a few other technical aspects that we found interesting. But other than that, we're going to stay very, very focused for this show. Unfortunately, we can't get into this fight without first talking about the judging. It's a sad fact of MMA that the officiating is not catching up to the level of action inside the cage. And last night, it reared its ugly head yet again, as Robbie Lawler was awarded a split decision victory over Johnny Hendricks that is debatable whether or not he deserved. I have no personal issues with anyone who scored it 48-47 for Robbie Lawler. I personally scored it 48-47 in favor of Johnny Hendricks. What is unforgivable is Glenn Trowbridge's 49-46 scorecard, in which he awarded the second round to Robbie Lawler, a round that was possibly the most clear round for Johnny Hendricks in the entire fight. I'm perfectly happy to open up a debate on whether or not Johnny Hendricks should have been rewarded for what in large part was, towards the end of the fight, largely a stalling tactic, though I thought he did enough in the fourth round early on to win. While the stalling and Robbie Lawler going to work at the end of the fourth round is really what stuck in people's heads, Johnny Hendricks was actually quite active and quite diligent with his striking earlier in that round. And it largely got erased from most people's memories by the dramatic nature in which his offense died off in the last minute or so of that round, and how Robbie Lawler really picked up his output towards the end of that round. Now, what's a really interesting bit of veteran savvy is that Robbie Lawler really used his energy well. He essentially came out strong in the first half of the first round. And then basically took the next 2 rounds off as Johnny Hendricks really got his offense going, which we're going to talk about a little bit in a second. And then came back the last minute of the fourth round, and then for the last basically half of the fifth round, Robbie Lawler really turned up the output. So essentially for about a round and a half of high output fighting, Robbie Lawler won a 5-round fight. And it was just well-timed aggression, paired with very, very poorly timed passivity on the part of Johnny Hendricks. And before we get to, let's get to it right now. As much as Robbie Lawler won this fight by being crafty and knowing when to turn it up, Johnny Hendricks lost this fight by having absolutely no idea how to fight in championship rounds. At this point, it seems exceedingly clear that Johnny Hendricks just does not really get how to close out a fight. The 3-round fight with Carlos Condit, he allowed Condit to rally back hard after he had dominated the first 2 rounds of that fight, very nearly losing the fight or forcing a draw. As there were some people who wrongly, in my opinion, argued that Condit should have gotten a 10-8, and left a lot of people saying that if it had been a 5-round fight, that Condit clearly would have won. The George St. Pierre fight, no matter how you scored it, even if you think it's the biggest robbery of all time, you have to acknowledge the fact that Johnny Hendricks lost that fight in the 5th round by completely taking the 5th round off and not just putting his mark on the fight and putting his boot on St. Pierre's neck and finishing it. And yet again, we have another instance of this. Johnny Hendricks, if he doesn't blow a guy away very early on with a kind of one-shot knockout power, he doesn't really know how to get the ball rolling downhill and just keep it rolling and just overwhelm guys. He has a tendency to let off the gas. and he tends to just get rather passive. And against Robbie Lawler, at the end of both the fourth and the fifth round, he did one of basically the worst things you can do in MMA, which is to passively cling to a single leg. Not actively trying to finish it, just turtled up, holding on to a single leg. It looks terrible. It lets your opponent go to work on your body and your head. And it really it leaves you vulnerable to all sorts of bits of offense. And it's just an awful position, and he was leaving himself there. And judging by the end of the fourth round, the way he popped up, almost by choice, he seemed to be okay with just kind of stalling out there for a little bit and kind of waiting out the last minute of the round, thinking he had already done enough. And I'm not sure if he understood the amount of impact that made on the judges. It's a clear problem for Johnny Hendricks at this point, and it's not entirely a coaching problem. Mark Lehman was yelling at him in the corner, screaming at him that they needed to win this round, and Johnny Hendricks just did not listen. And at this point, it appears to be a Johnny Hendricks problem. It'll be interesting to see what happens moving forward. Pretty much any time we see Johnny Hendricks now past the second round, we're going to have some insight on if this is a problem that he is addressing, or if it's going to be something that continues to be an issue for him. Now, one thing that we need to keep in mind is that while we're focusing on these negatives, and we're going to get to both a little bit more about what Hendricks was doing wrong and what Lawler was doing very right in this fight, Hendricks did actually show some growth in some respects. His boxing and his striking looked to be very much on point through large stretches of this fight. And Hendricks has always been kind of adding to his striking game. One big piece that he added coming into the GSP fight was use of his lead hand, his right hand, which coming in, everyone was so focused on his left hand because that's the hand that he used to launch John Fitch and Martin Kampmann into orbit with. But it was really his right hand that gave St. Pierre the most trouble in their fight. In addition, he also started mixing in kind of mid-range knees that really made St. Pierre think twice about shooting in on him. And we saw both of those come into play in this fight. Hendricks' right hand was a big factor and was marking up the left side of Lawler's face from the second round on. And additionally, a toy that he brought out in the first Lawler fight, the low kick game, seemed very, very much evolved as he really went to work on Lawler's left leg and did a lot of really good damage there, it seemed, as Lawler seemed to be hampered by it at times. And then he just got away from it later in the fight as he chose to kind of ineffectively wrestle. And so it's one of those things that Hendricks is evolving, but for some reason his wrestling game has been one of the weakest aspects of his game. Offensive wrestling, I should say, is one of the weakest aspects of his MMA game, which is extremely odd considering the level of wrestler that Hendricks was in college. And his wrestling pedigree does show in some ways. His defensive wrestling is excellent. George St. Pierre fought mightily to take Johnny Hendricks down, and it's really a testament to the technical ability of George St. Pierre that he was able to get Hendricks down at all. But why was Hendricks so ineffective in a wrestling context against Robbie Lawler? And to put it shortly, it's because Robbie Lawler won the angle battles and he won the head position battles in almost every respect. There's an excellent video by Firas Zahabi that he put out recently on his TriStar YouTube page, in which he details how to defend a double leg. And he goes into detail on sprawling. And for the people watching the video, I'm about to put that video up right now. So you can see that one of the things that they address is the idea that you need to angle off of a shot. You want to be you want to be at that right angle to the guy, similar to how in boxing you want to angle off of a punch, you want to angle off of a takedown shot and get heavy on guys. Lawler was able to do this. He was never able to fully sprawl out. Hendricks is too strong and too solid for him to just put Hendricks' face on the floor with a simple sprawl. But he was able to use that angle and take it back to the cage. And against the cage, Hendricks' wrestling is not very good. Hendricks he's a decent wrestler in the center of the cage. If he can grab a single leg and finish it in the middle of the cage, he's fine. But against the cage, Hendricks doesn't really seem to have much of an answer. And you can see here that Lawler was making pretty good use of getting the angle on Hendricks. And really the only time Hendricks was able to successfully get takedowns, which I can think of about 2 instances in which Hendricks was able to successfully get a takedown. One time he just cut the corner and got around to the side of Lawler and took him down. And another time, he quite literally, he stepped in, he got a good penetrating step between Lawler's feet, got his hips in, and quite literally picked Lawler up and then took the angle on Lawler while he was in the air. So Lawler, in the middle of the cage and on the cage, was able to get on that angle that he needed to. And then the second step, what Zahabi pointed out, is fighting the head down. That you force the head down. And that really kills their ability to drive. It kills their ability to finish the takedown. So in this case, you can see in this image right here, and if you're listening on all audio, it is a shot of Robbie Lawler using his left hand. It's very difficult to see, literally shoving Hendricks' head down between his legs, getting it out of position and getting Hendricks out of position to finish his double leg. And then they ended up against the cage, and then the fight spent a good portion of time in this position with Lawler with his base spread wide and Hendricks kind of straight on with him, trying to drive him through the cage. And at that point, Hendricks' finishes are very, very limited. He can either try to lift Lawler off the cage like he did earlier in the fight. Other than that, there's really not a lot of options there. He has to try to get an angle, and Lawler was just winning that battle consistently. And in the few instances that he did get Lawler down, we've seen that Lawler has added to his game an excellent little butterfly guard that he uses to get back up very efficiently. So all in all, it was a pretty outstanding technical wrestling battle, in addition to some really fun boxing and some really fun striking exchanges. All-around great fight, and like I said, I can't fault anyone who scored that for Robbie Lawler, as Robbie Lawler was more diligently pursuing the end of the fight, while as Johnny Hendricks clearly assumed he was winning on the scorecards and took time off, which is just, you cannot do in MMA. It's been proven time and again that taking time off in the middle of the cage is one of the worst things you can do in this sport, and it's bitten Johnny Hendricks yet again. Moving from that to 2 guys who never take any time off in the cage, let's talk about the lightweight title fight between Anthony Pettis and Gilbert Melendez. And this was another outstanding fight, mostly because Gilbert Melendez came out and did exactly what he needed to do to win this fight. He came out and he pressured Melendez right back to the fence, using a good jab to back Pettis up, and as soon as Pettis got anywhere near the cage, Melendez would just rush the distance and clinch Pettis up and just tried to stifle all the dynamic striking right out of Anthony Pettis. This is largely because the one thing that has given Gilbert Melendez fits in his career is kickers. Good, solid kickers have given Melendez problems. It's how Josh Thompson beat Gilbert Melendez. It's how Ben Henderson was able to frustrate Gilbert Melendez at times. And Anthony Pettis is probably, if not definitely, the best kicker at lightweight. You can't hang around on the outside against this guy. Your liver will get kicked out the other side of your body. So at that point, Melendez had very little choice. He had to close that distance. He had to make this a clinch fight. He had to try to drag Pettis down to the ground and make it as ugly and draining as a fight as possible, and attempt to drag Pettis into dark waters, or deep waters, I should say, because Anthony Pettis has only really been in a 5-round fight, the full 5 rounds, once in his entire career against Benson Henderson. And if you recall that fight, they were both awfully tired at the end of that, and Pettis was able to pull out the Showtime kick to seal that one up. This is the only time he's gone past 3 rounds in his entire career. So for Gilbert Melendez, he had the perfect strategy. He was executing it perfectly. The problem was simply he was up against Anthony Pettis. Even in the slightest chances, the smallest openings, Anthony Pettis was able to deliver pretty nasty kicks that had a pretty deep effect on Gilbert Melendez. And then obviously in the second round, Anthony Pettis was able to beat Melendez to the punch, just getting off first and getting off faster with his boxing and taking some of the inside angles, and hurt Melendez to the body. Or I'm sorry, to the head, hurt Melendez to the head, and as Melendez kind of dived in on on a takedown to just kind of buy himself some time. Anthony Pettis transitioned immediately into an Arming guillotine choke, dropped back, locked everything up, and then as Melendez postured his hips up in the air and tried to take pressure off of his neck, and then leaned a little bit to his left, or I should say to his right, to try to angle so he could loosen up the choke, Pettis bumped him right over into mounted guillotine finish. Absolutely brutal. It's a really refreshing bit of guillotine play, as even about 5 years ago, the level of guillotining in MMA was not necessarily good. We heard a lot about how guys had this natural squeeze that just made their guillotines so brutal. And yes, squeeze is a part of guillotines, but we're seeing a lot more technical guillotine play in MMA. A lot more guys able to roll in and finish that mounted guillotine, which takes significantly less squeeze and natural strength and is much more about position. And if you go back and watch that fight, you can see Pettis drive his hips in and get the immediate death face tapping from Gilbert Melendez when that choke was really, really in. It was an excellent piece of grappling by Pettis, and just awesome transition, pure MMA style fighting. Going from strikes, you heard him with strikes, immediately transition down into a choke. When he's dazed, he's hurt, he's thinking he can hang out there, because a lot of guys don't have that instinct to go for that choke because they've been burned by it so many times, either in competition or in the gym, dropping back for chokes. The real thing here is Anthony Pettis he's kind of on that cutting edge when it comes to grappling, because he's not a grappler. He's only learned grappling in an MMA context for the purposes of fighting MMA. And while that doesn't always translate to excellent grappling, in fact, there's a lot of MMA fighters out there with terrible grappling because they've only ever had to learn grappling for MMA, and you don't need to have a ton of grappling to really compete in MMA. You need to have to reach the UFC, you don't have to have a ton. You can be a fairly serviceable blue or purple belt level at jiu-jitsu and be like a high school wrestler, and that can be enough if you've got enough athleticism and enough skills in other places to make up for that. Anthony Pettis is a straight up finisher. I mean, on the ground, on the feet, he's a threat to finish the fight at any point. So at that point, his grappling is geared towards finishing fights, and he's got a game that's very, very well suited now for MMA. And part of that might be because he never learned grappling in a pure grappling context. It can absolutely work. It gives you a wonderful depth of game. I mean, guys like Damian Maia and Fabricio Werdum I will always admire for their technical brilliance. But Anthony Pettis has a real handle on the idea that if you drop back for guard, if you end up in guard, you have... I mean, it's something referred to now. It's becoming a phrase. The 60-second guard. Firas Zahabi teaches it quite diligently at his university, and Firas is very kind of plugged into that East Coast MMA scene with Renzo Gracie and John Danaher and Sarah Longo, and you can be assured that this is how guys are training grappling now. MMA is pure sprint grappling. As soon as you hit the ground, you are working. You only have in most scenarios 2 to 2.5 minutes to go to work. It's very rare to see a guy get taken down within the first minute and a half of a round, and for the top man to have a good 4 minutes to go to work. And even then, that's not a lot of time for high-level grapplers to engage in that step-by-step grappling where I advance from guard to half guard, and then I grip fight, and then I advance to side control, and then I catch the mount or catch the back, and then I set up a submission hold from one of those positions, because a lot of that is predicated on solidifying your position, getting the grip you want, and then waiting for your opponent to make a mistake. And you don't have that time in MMA. You have to kind of force the action a bit. And strikes help with that. It makes setting things up much easier, that you can just hit the person to force them to move and force them to make a mistake. But the limited time is something that I feel a lot of guys have a hard time adjusting their games to. And Anthony Pettis has adjusted it wonderfully. And how that comes into play against Gilbert Melendez is Anthony Pettis is extremely confident in his ability to get back up. The 60-second guard means that you have 60 seconds to submit, to sweep, and in lieu of those two things, after 60 seconds, you need to be standing back up. You need to be using the guard to get back to your feet. And Pettis is supremely confident in his ability to get up, which is why he doesn't fear actually playing guard a bit. It's one of the reasons why he was able to catch Benson Henderson in an armbar in their title match at UFC 164. It's not that, I mean, it is that Anthony Pettis is an explosive athlete who's, I think, has an incredible leg strength. The way that when he captures guys with his guard, or with his, in this case, closing his guard to finish the guillotine, or when he's locked up triangles. I'm thinking particularly of when he triangled Shane Roller, who is not a weak man in any sense of the word, and was able to maintain that and keep Shane Roller from posturing out. He's got to have some incredible leg strength, and the speed at which he puts these on is incredible. And those are big factors in the success of submissions from the bottom game. Don't be fooled. It's a big reason why you don't see a lot of high level guys get caught in submissions from the bottom in pure grappling or in MMA, is because it needs to be perfect, and it needs to be fast, and it needs to be strong. It takes technique and athleticism. In Anthony Pettis' case, when he caught Benson Henderson, he has the confidence in his ability that he will go for it in a place where many, many other fighters will not. A classic example being Brandon Vera against John Jones. John Jones left his arms out in that guard, in Brandon Vera's guards, fully extended, begging to be armbarred, and Brandon Vera just never opened his guard and never went for it. And then when John Jones fought a better athlete, a more experienced grappler in Vitor Belfort, Vitor had the experience, he had the technical ability and the athleticism and the confidence to just say screw it and throw up the armbar, and he very nearly got the win. And in this case, like Pettis has the confidence in his ability to recover if the armbar fails. And that's why he was able to armbar Benson Henderson. That's why he had no compulsions to dropping back for a guillotine on Gilbert Melendez. I mean, dropping back for a guillotine on Gilbert Melendez for most other guys would be a terrible idea, because you're playing directly into what Gilbert Melendez wants to do. He wants to get you down. He wants to go to work on you. So it was a sign of Anthony Pettis' confidence in his own game. The fact that he is kind of on that cutting edge, that he knows that when he transitions, he needs to be transitioning to some sort of finishing position or advantageous position. And actually, this segues nicely into a question that I got from a person on Twitter, Harry J. Sanderson, asking if I'd compare Sergio to his brother Anthony in terms of potential, ability, and achievements at this state in their career. So first of all, Sergio Pettis is in his third year of fighting, which is around the time that Anthony Pettis was starting to take off in the WEC. They're not on the same track. Prospect-wise, not even close. Anthony Pettis was in the WEC, had championship potential written all over him. The Bart Pawlowski loss at the end of his second year fighting was the kind of loss that, actually I should say it's the third year fighting. So that right around now is when Anthony Pettis got the shine taken off of him a little bit by Bart Pawlowski. But he was kind of tabbed as a future champion right away. Sergio Pettis, despite being nicknamed the Phenom, is going to have a bit longer road to victory. And one of the things here is that Sergio Pettis does not seem to have his brother's understanding of this aspect of the grappling game. Now, the first round of Pettis-Hobar was Sergio Pettis versus Matt Hobar was a pretty solid example of Sergio Pettis' flaws. Number one, he's hittable. And Patrick Wyman mentioned this on the MMA Perspectives podcast, which myself and Zane Simon, which is live on Google Hangouts on Fridays and then goes up on Bloody Elbow on Saturdays, that most of the really good fighters, strikers, are pretty hittable in the beginning. Striking defense is one of the things that takes time to develop. It's not a skill that guys just pick up. It takes actual craft. It's not something you can kind of just athlete. So the fact that he's hittable at this stage in his career is not overly concerning. But Matt Hobart tagged him early, hurt him early, and put Pettis in trouble. The other thing you saw from Pettis' game is, number one, his wrestling isn't particularly good. He's very easy to take down, even from a not outstanding wrestler like Matt Hobart. And then, when Pettis is on his back, Sergio Pettis likes to play guard. He likes to spend a lot of time in guard, and he will bypass opportunities to stand up in pursuit of more takedowns. And he did it several times in the first round against Hobart. He had chances to stand up. Hobart stood in his guard, stood in Pettis' open guard, was standing over him. Hobart was controlling a foot, but Pettis chose not to scramble. He chose to stay there and let Hobart re-engage, and essentially cost himself the first round doing so. And that's kind of the grappling game that a lot of guys who are confident in their guards can end up sucked into, where they so much want to play guard that they end up giving the round away because they feel like if they can just go a little bit longer, they can find something. And it ends up biting people, and it's to the point where having a great guard game, it acts as a takedown deterrent to a certain degree. It acts like wrestling, that guys don't want to take you down for fear of ending up in your guard. But for the most part, it's a skill that's nice to have, but it's not critical, because even when you have it, you're not assured of victory through that skill. And Pettis, I think Sergio Pettis, he's going to lose a fight at some point in his developmental process by simply being too content on his back. It seems like that's going to be the case. Now, this isn't to say that he's a garbage prospect, because the next two rounds really showed off what Sergio does well. He strikes very well. He strikes going backwards exceedingly well. He was using great angles on Hobart and was setting up right crosses on Hobart pretty much the last two rounds whenever he wanted, just off of Hobart's kind of straight movement. He really shut down Hobart's takedown game just through the use of good angle footwork, and every time Hobart came forward, Pettis was off and to his right, and then tagging him with a right hand, and really keeping Hobart from getting his offense going. So Sergio Pettis, if you're interested in talking about Sergio Pettis, I highly recommend you go listen to the MMA Prospectus from last Friday. You got my thoughts on it, you got Zane's thoughts on it, and you got Patrick's thoughts on it. To summarize mine, I think he's a potential top 10 guy at either flyweight or bantamweight. I don't see him as a longtime champion. I don't see him kind of occupying that space that Anthony Pettis is occupying in his weight class. But I see him turning into a very good fighter down the road. Okay, so one more thing we need to talk about this card. Being a grappler, I would not be able to walk away from this card without mentioning the fact that we saw not one, but two Bulldog chokes in this fight card. The Bulldog choke is a fairly rare submission because it's not used very often in the pure grappling, because you don't end up in position for it very frequently. It's seen often as kind of a garbage submission, but it gets kind of a bad rap, because the version of it that most people think of is the Carlos Newton and Pat Miletich style one, which you basically got to see in the Raquel Pennington-Ashley Evans-Smith fight, in which Pennington turned what was like a schoolyard headlock into a chokehold on Evans-Smith. And it's one of those things that, yes, it is not exactly the most technically brilliant choke out there, but it is a choke. You have to respect it, and if you play your hand wrong, you can absolutely be finished by it. And Evan Smith did precisely the wrong thing in this instance and tried to finish a single leg while she was wrapped up in that choke without addressing the issue of actually being in that choke. And Pennington was actually able to kind of sit down on Evan Smith's left arm and trap it there in kind of a... Well, it wasn't quite a crucifix hold, but it tied up her arm just long enough for her to really get in on the neck. And essentially what a Bulldog choke is to clear up some of it's essentially a rear naked choke. It's the same grip as a rear naked choke. Your arm is going from behind their head, around their neck, and under their chin. and you're using your other arm to add some additional force as you apply pressure to both the front of the neck and the sides of the neck, depending on where your arm position is. In the case of the Evan Smith choke, it was pretty clear this was a blood choke because of how quickly she went out. So there was some good compression getting on both sides of the neck. In the Faber-Rivera fight, which before we even talk about, we need to mention the fact that an eye poke set it up. And I don't believe, watching it, it looked like Faber was simply throwing his hand out to try to get Rivera to throw his hands up so he could shoot in for a takedown, or potentially playing even a step further and throwing his hand out, hoping that Rivera would drop his hands to defend a takedown and then come over the top with that trademark overhand right of Uriah Faber's. It didn't look intentional in any way, but Mario Yamasaki needs to call that. And it gets back to the idea that the fact that Mario Yamasaki is still in the cage at all really reflects the idea that the athletes in the cage right now are far ahead of the officials who are in the cage with them or are surrounding the cage scoring the fights, because Mario Yamasaki has a clear history of just flubbing these sort of things, and yet another prime example of it. But getting back to the choke, the case for Uriah Faber, it looked like there may have been some neck cranking action in there also, as Faber kind of bore down on it, but definitely good pressure on both sides of the neck also. So essentially what a Bulldog choke is it's the same grip as a rear naked choke, but instead of being on the person's back, you're essentially on their side. And you can see this choke sometimes. Marcelo Garcia actually really favors this choke from the crucifix if he has that near arm kind of trapped. Actually, very similar to the position that Ashley Evans Smith ended up in with her arm being trapped in the legs of Raquel Pennington and then choked. Marcelo Garcia is a big fan of that crucifix position and then applying a rear naked choke from that, because apparently when you get as good at jiu-jitsu as Marcelo Garcia is, the idea of putting the hooks in on the back just becomes boring and too easy. So he prefers to finish his choke with no hooks. So we're starting to see, the reason we're seeing this in MMA is because of the scrambling, and the reason you don't see this in jiu-jitsu is because the worst thing in a jiu-jitsu tournament you can do is give up your back. So you won't expose your back in the same ways that MMA fighters do trying to stand up. And since they do expose their back in MMA much more freely, Brandon Shaw doing a prime example of it against Travis Brown, attempting to expose his back to relieve strikes from the mount so that Travis Brown would be hitting the back of his head so he'd have something to complain about to the ref. Or an attempt to stand back up, which Ashley Evans Smith, they were already standing and Raquel Pennington just bulldogged him down. Or in the case of Uriah Faber. Uriah Faber is really excellent at transitioning to the back after he's hurt someone and they drop down to kind of like a sitting guard position. Faber's really excellent at transitioning to the back and getting the choke. And in that case, when he spun, he wasn't able to get his legs around, but he was able to get his arm around the neck and just apply that horrendous squeeze. So it's a really fun little thing that seems to be catching on in MMA as transition submissions, again, getting in the idea of transition and finding the finish. It's a bit of MMA grappling that is not unique to MMA, but the situation arises far more in MMA and makes it much more of an MMA type submission. And it's part of what makes this sport fun. So, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Inside the Guard with TP Grant. I will be back talking about the UFC on Fox next week. Until then, have a fantastic week.